Hey, welcome back. We're going to move on to step number 2, and that is starting the process of making our bread. So it's been about almost 6 hours later, and as you can see, our starter here is really bubbly, it's overflowing, so I would say that it's about at peak activation here. Smells great. So let's get started. So we've got our scale. The first thing I like to do is measure out 25 grams of salt. You can use pink Himalayan salt, or you can use sea salt. Today I'm gonna use sea salt. So we'll just turn it to 0 with the little cup on there. And it just makes it just easier as we're going to pour it into a smaller bowl. So we'll just measure out 25 grams. We'll take that off, set it aside. And then we're gonna put our big bowl on top, tear it out so that it's at 0. And then what we're gonna do is put in about 125, 130 grams of our sourdough starter. It's looking really good. And this doesn't have to be an exact science. I have found that as I've switched using different flours, I've kind of played around with the amount of starter that I use. Using something like the King Arthur flour, that has a lot more gluten in it, so it's going to really ferment and really rise really well. But with something like Einkorn that has a low gluten content, and this kind of flour is just very different from American flour. So I've had to really play around with the amount of starter I use and just see how it turns out. So don't be afraid to play around with, you know, maybe you want 150, 145, and just keep track of the amount of grams of starter that you use and play around with it. So we've got about 130 grams of the starter. We're gonna tear it out so it's back at 0. And then what we're gonna do is add in 300 grams of purified water. Okay, so I'm at like 310 right now. And then we've already measured out our sea salt, so we'll just put the sea salt in. Now with the water, just depending on the level of humidity that's in your area, you might have to also play around with the water. I've noticed that when I use einkorn flour, I have to use a lot less water. With something like King Arthur, I have to use 450 grams of water. But this is just a different texture of flour. So again, don't be afraid to play around with it. Maybe you need a little more than that, maybe a little less. So we've got the 300 grams of water. We're gonna tear it out so it's at 0 again. And then we will add in our flour, and we're gonna add in 600 grams of flour. And this one I'm just using the Einkorn unbleached, but I also think I wanna add in some of the whole wheat because I kinda like that wheat texture, that whole grain texture. So I've got a little bag of this, and it doesn't matter, it doesn't have to be exactly half. You could put in as little or as much as you like, just to play around with it. Sometimes I've even added in rye flour. So just experiment with what kind of bread you like. Do a little bit more of this. Okay, so we're at 600. So then we'll just take it off the scale. You can use a dough whisk if you like. Sometimes that helps to start it all getting gathered together. In fact, I don't know what happened with the dough whisk, so that's fine. We'll just use this. So we'll just start stirring it around and mixing it up real well. Sometimes I get my fingers in there just because it seems to mix a little bit better with your hands. So you will get a little bit messy, but that's the fun part. So you just want to get all that flour mixed in really well. Don't really have to worry about don't over mix it here, I guess. But just make sure all the flour is getting into that dough part. All the flour at the bottom there. Great, this is looking like a nice dense lump of dough here. And obviously if you use more water, it's gonna be a lot more sticky. And it's just really hard to work with. So that's why I ended up using less water. Okay, so we've got our dough here. And so now we're gonna start with the first rise. So what I do, even though it's warm, it's still warm out, it's very humid, I am going to cover this with a damp towel so that it's like wrung out really well, because the top of this will kind of dry out and you want to keep this nice and moist. So what I'll do is I'll put it in my oven with the oven light on. I'll wait an hour, and then every 30 minutes I'm going to fold the dough. And then I will fold for a total of 4 times. So when you're folding, you're just pulling each edge over to the side, each corner, like so. There's no wrong way to go about this. My daughter likes to do this for me. So that's basically what you will do after an hour, each half hour, 4 times total. And then after that 4th time, you're gonna let it set in the oven overnight for about 10 to 12 hours. It might take longer if it's colder. So you're gonna want to check on it. And if it's risen about, up to this line here, the whole thing will just be a massive dough. It'll be really nice. Then that will be your clue that it's ready. So we'll go ahead and put it in the dough, and then we'll check back in the morning.